Remember the city of Portland's $6 million plan to address gun violence? It's okay if you don't. It was a long year. Well, it turns out a lot of the community groups who were supposed to get money still haven't. And now there are even more delays.
I would say it is frustrating, but it's not surprising.
And it's been almost a year since the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And since then, extremism has become more and more embedded in our local politics.
It's all about local legislation, your local school districts, your city council, board of supervisors.
A lot of them are taking it upon themselves to re-engage in the broader conservative culture war.
Here's the story.
Hey everybody, I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story. You'll actually see we have coverage on the insurrection, the first anniversary being tomorrow, tonight and tomorrow. We'll explain more about that coming up here on the show. But in the meantime, if you're not familiar, this is the show where we really want to hear from you. Your comments and your questions drive our coverage. We got so many last night. It was my first show back since the holidays. So you see a lot of those sprinkled throughout the show. But you can see the contact info at the bottom of the screen. So please use it. Use that hashtag, The Story KGW, or email thestory@kgw.com. And with all that being said, let's get started. Let's get first to our big story. City leaders in Portland hoped this year would be better than the last. 2021, as I'm sure you're aware, saw record amounts of gun violence. And now, just 5 days into the new year, 5 days into 2022, things aren't looking much better. Since New Year's Day, 3 people have been murdered in Portland, all of them victims of gun violence. And by now, the city was supposed to have announced more grants for those community groups who are working to stop these shootings, to quell the gun violence. But as investigative reporter Kyle Leboshi found, that plan has hit a roadblock, and the money may still be months away.
As Portland continues to face a stunning wave of gun violence, KGW has learned the latest round of funding for community organizations working to address the crisis has been delayed. This most recent setback has frustrated community activists like Royal Harris, who's working to stop the bloodshed.
We each have the ability to be an impact on our community, but sometimes this waiting for government to solve the problem only exacerbates the problem.
In November, 35 community organizations submitted their grant applications to help reduce gun violence. $600,000 in city funds were up for grabs. The groups expected to learn whether they got the money by late December, with awards announced in early January. But this week they were told there's been a problem. The city's Office of Violence Prevention wrote in an email to applicants that funds wouldn't be awarded until the first quarter of 2022, which means this critical funding may not be available until March.
At the end of the quarter, what we're basically saying is it took us a year. And I think that's really horrifying.
Pastor Matt Hennessy of Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church says the city must move faster. There were more than 1,200 confirmed shootings in Portland last year, the most in recorded history. In April of 2021, the City Council approved an unprecedented $4.1 million to help community organizations step up their efforts to help stop the shootings.
The reality is that this issue demands immediate action.
But since that plan was approved, the city has been slow to get the money into the hands of those who needed it most. In an email to KGW, Senior Policy Advisor Nate Takara wrote, "The initial timeline that was created was very aggressive, with the intent of getting the funds out quickly as possible. The urgency to get the funds out quickly has not changed. However, the city needs to ensure the funds meet the intent of city leaders."
There are times when things take a while. This is unprecedented. And I have no idea why it is, but it is an emergency, and somebody needs to understand that this is long overdue and get this funding moving ASAP.
The problem with the latest round of funding? According to a city spokesperson, several large nonprofits applied for the grant money, which was earmarked for smaller organizations that haven't previously worked with city government. Administrators put the brakes on the process so they could retroactively weed out those larger organizations, resulting in yet another delay.
I would say it is frustrating, but it's not surprising. And I think because we have a history within our city and within city government and how it moves funds and resources through the Black community and other at-risk communities, that is very slow and tedious, and at times it's stop and start.
Some community leaders are especially frustrated because they say it's these smaller organizations that can really make a difference. They're nimble and deal directly with those in the street. By keeping them waiting, we're just making a bad situation worse. Kyle Aboshi, KGW News.
Let's get to a shakeup now at the Oregon legislature. This headline broke today. Senate President Peter Courtney is retiring at the end of his term. He's held that position, Senate President, since 2003. And in fact, he's the longest serving lawmaker in the legislature right now, with a combined 37 years in the Senate and the House. And today, he sent a text message to members of the Senate Democratic Caucus. He wrote to them, "Colleagues, I am not going to be running again for the legislature." This is a text. He wrote, "I will serve out the remainder of my term. It has been an honor and a privilege to have been allowed to serve locally on the Salem City Council and for all these years in the Oregon State Legislature. I hope I've helped." Now, Courtney has made it clear in the past that the political climate in Salem has become harder and harder to deal with. In fact, here's what he told us in an interview last summer.
The value of compromise is no longer considered valuable. The value of working, of understanding that you cannot be a public official if you do not have the ability to talk and work with and painfully compromise with someone who thinks very differently than you. That is no longer considered a value. It's nice on your programs. You say it all the time, working together. But the fact is that is not rewarded now. That is not rewarded. I know what I'm talking about.
So this is just the latest in a number of leadership changes at the Oregon legislature. Courtney's Republican counterpart, Senator Fred Girod, recently stepped down as Senate Minority Leader. And Girod told us last year that he likely won't run again either. House Minority Leader Christine Drazen recently stepped down to focus on her campaign for governor. And House Speaker Tina Kotek, who's also running for governor, is expected to do the same soon. And speaking, by the way, of the governor's race, let's talk more about the requirements for that position, because a lot of you at home had questions about this. So first, to recap, last night we told you that former New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof is trying to prove that he's eligible to run for governor. Secretary of State's office is questioning specifically his residency, since he voted in New York in 2020 instead of voting in Oregon. And the state constitution says you have to be an Oregon resident for 3 years before running for governor. Kristof's team argues since he owns property here, he considers Oregon home, he spends a lot of time here, that means he is a resident. Secretary of State Shemia Fagan could decide as soon as this week on Kristof's eligibility. So we'll, of course, keep you posted. But in the meantime, again, we got a lot of questions from you guys about this and about other Oregon politicians. Neil, case in point, wrote in, why not look at Charlie Hales and his questionable residency when running for Portland mayor? Neil, thank you so much. So back in 2011, when Hales was a mayoral candidate, the Oregonian reported that he actually listed a Washington address on his taxes from 2004 to 2009. And he said that was so he didn't have to pay a personal income tax, since Washington doesn't have one. However, he says he was registered to vote in Oregon. That, of course, did not end up disqualifying Hales from running, since he was ultimately elected mayor. On to the next. Dana also had an interesting question. She wrote, can someone tell me the difference between his, meaning Kristof's, residency and Ron Wyden's residency? It seems, she wrote, that Senator Wyden straddles the same line. Dana, thank you so much. Again, you might be familiar with this controversy too. In 2005, Senator Wyden married a woman who owns a bookstore in New York City, and he reportedly has homes in New York, Portland, and Washington, D.C. Now, his team says he splits time between all of them, and in 2011, he sold his condo in Portland. However, a spokesperson told the Oregonian that was just because his kids are getting older and he was searching for a house instead of a condo here in Oregon. Now, according to the Secretary of State's website, Wyden is registered to vote in Oregon. His registration lists a residential address in Southeast Portland, which we've kindly blacked out for the purposes of this segment. So that is the key difference here between Wyden and Christoph's residency questions. Since again, Christoph, the key point here, was not registered to vote in Oregon in 2020. And that is what the Secretary of State is now asking him about. All right. Let's switch gears now and talk about tomorrow. You've probably seen it is the first anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, a historic example of extremism on a national stage. But researchers who study these things say over the last year, extremists have kind of shifted gears, leaving the national stage behind and focusing on local politics instead. Here's NBC's Brandy Zadronsky.
January 6, 2021. USA! Crowds marched to the U.S. Capitol building. Throngs of people grew into thousands. Denise Aguilar posted to social media that day, saying she was there.
The revolution's here, guys. We stormed the Capitol, and patriots broke open the doors.
Aguilar later said she never breached the building nor participated in violence. And since then, she's taken her fight back home.
It's all about local legislation, your local school districts, your city council, board of supervisors. So it kicked off as a national movement that it's now parents are realizing we need to start coming to the local government.
Her shift is part of a broader trend, according to Jared Holt, who studies domestic extremism at the nonpartisan think tank, the Atlantic Council.
Domestic extremism is really like a fluid that matches the container that it's in any given moment.
In a new report, Holt says that following backlash and hundreds of arrests connected to the attack on the Capitol, far-right activists have shifted their focus from national politics to local.
A lot of the adaptations that we've seen came in the form of kind of decentralizing these national movements.
What are these extremists all talking about at the local level? What is the content?
A lot of them are taking it upon themselves to re-engage in the broader conservative culture war.
We are here to protect the children of our community.
For Aguilar, who we met outside a local school board meeting in California, it's opposition to mandates.
We figured out that going to the Capitol and working that particular piece doesn't do anything because these legislators have already made up their mind.
She is the founder of a group called Mamalitia and says her activism is peaceful.
Do we look violent to you? Do we look like we're trying to storm any place? Have I ever done anything violent in the Capitol? Absolutely not.
Like many who share her goals, Aguilar uses alternative social media platforms like Telegram to organize and strategize.
This is what they're doing at the school board meetings.
Those go local tactics also being embraced by prominent white nationalists.
This is the right approach. Going to the school board meetings, going out to protest.
Groups like the Proud Boys responding, taking to the streets of towns in Long Island and North Carolina to protest public health measures.
Extremist groups have always seen the culture wars as a place that has enough anger and division already that it can be fruitful for them.
Are we in a better place now than we were on January 5th of last year?
I do think there have been some reassuring signs, but the undercurrents and the conditions that led to January 6th, this popularization of conspiracy theories, of extreme sentiments and ideologies, is maybe more pernicious than it was last year.
And with the focus off the nation's capital for now, the impact of that extremism can be felt anywhere. Brandy Zadronsky, NBC News, Washington.
Let's talk about a disturbing pattern, racist chants and harassment directed at high school athletes. A girls' basketball coach says it happened in Camas, and it's far from an isolated incident. When the story continues.
Welcome back. Keep sending in those questions and comments to thestory@kgw.com or use that hashtag #TheStoryKGW on Twitter. We want to turn now to allegations of racist slurs directed at, of all people, high school girls basketball players. It was during a game played last month in Camas, and Portland's Benson High School was the visiting team. Benson players say the racist slurs came from the Camas student section. Here's Tim Gordon.
During a game at Camas High School on December 10th, Benson coach Eric Knox calls a timeout in the third quarter over what his black and brown-skinned players were telling him. Later he wrote, "Throughout the game, both during play and timeouts, a number of my players told me one-on-one that they were hearing individuals from the student section using the N-word to taunt our players." Coach Knox wrote that in a complaint to the Camas School District. The district received the complaint on December 13th and says, "The same day we launched an investigation led by a neutral third party and consulted with the Washington Interscholastic Activities Association." That comes from Interim Superintendent Doug Hood in a letter sent to Camas High School families this past Monday. Hood also wrote, "Racist slurs and remarks have no place in our schools or anywhere and will not be tolerated. We take these accusations very seriously and are committed to aiding a complete and thorough investigation." It is clear from game footage that Coach Knox had had enough for his players' sake. Referees had to stop him from approaching the Camas student section as he said, "We're not going to do this anymore." And Knox later wrote in his complaint, "Based on my team's experience in your gym Friday night, clearly you have a lot more work to do around fundamental principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion." The Washington Interscholastic Activities Association helps keep sports going at Camas High School and 800 other schools in Washington. Executive Director Mick Hoffman got the letter from Benson's coach, too.
Good for him for protecting the students, good for the students for trusting him to bring it forward.
While WIAA is not the investigator, Hoffman is helping coordinate and watching what he considers a credible case closely.
This is horrific. I mean, it has to be addressed. And so I appreciate Camas leadership addressing it. I appreciate the Benson team bringing it forward. And, hopefully we can get to a point where we're preventing rather than reacting.
In the end, Benson finished the game and won. And Knox added in his letter, "The Camas players were great. None of my players or parents heard or felt anything hostile or racial from them." Tim Gordon, KGW News.
So as we know, racism is rarely, if ever, an isolated incident. And in that point, we reached out to the Oregon School Activities Association. That's the agency that governs school sports. And they say they are investigating the Benson-Camas game. And they also say they're looking into a December basketball game between Clatskanie and De La Salle North Catholic High School. According to the Oregonian, girls from the De La Salle North team say Clatskanie players used racist slurs against them. And in November, the Oregonian also reported that white football players from LeGrand High School used racist language to taunt black players from Gladstone. It happened during a playoff game, and Gladstone kids said every black player on the team heard the slurs. One comment, they said, came from a referee. LeGrand players denied making those comments. And recently we got an email from a viewer. She wanted to stay anonymous, but she wrote, "I went to school in LeGrand, and as a BIPOC woman, I never felt comfortable off campus. She said, "I didn't feel fully safe on campus due to 3 white boys screaming Allahu Akbar at me, even though I am not Middle Eastern." We could go on. We found numerous incidents going back years happening at several different schools across the Northwest. In fact, it was such a problem that Oregon lawmakers have been trying to stop this for a while. Here's a clip from 2019.
2 weeks ago, during a game and during and after a game between the JV and the varsity girls basketball teams from Park Rose High School and St. Helens High School, at least 3 young men started yelling the N-word during the game and then followed the young women from Park Rose out to their bus, continuing the racist comments. Yes, I'd call this a bias crime.
So in 2019, Oregon lawmakers passed a bill aimed at trying to stop this kind of thing from happening. It's House Bill 3409, and it requires school districts to adopt policies that promote equity, dignity, and civil rights. And it also requires OSAA to address any reports of racist or derogatory behavior. And that being said, we also still get questions all the time about Oregon's rent assistance backlog. So coming up, we'll answer one next and then talk about why so many renters and landlords are showing up to court without lawyers. The Oregon State Bar says it's a big problem and they've got a plan. When the story continues. Welcome back. Here's a question from a viewer named Kathy. She wrote, who are the officials in charge of administering the rent assistance, and what is being done to increase accountability of those employees? Kathy, that's an awesome question. So the state agency in charge of getting rent assistance out the door in Oregon is called Oregon Housing and Community Services. That's their website. And then this is their live dashboard, which they launched to help the public track how much rent assistance has gone out. You can see that blue box on the left. At this point, $211.6 million has been dispensed to households. And we should note, as far as accountability is concerned, state lawmakers aren't necessarily threatening penalties to this agency for taking a while to get money out the door. They believe that the staff are overwhelmed by the need that they're seeing. And it's why last month they took more steps to kind of help them out and keep evictions at bay. They allocated $215 million toward assistance, and they extended what's known as the safe harbor, giving renters until June 2022 to apply for assistance. Once they apply, they have to apply. They are protected from getting evicted until their application is processed. The state has also hired dozens more surge employees to process applications faster. Now, despite all of this, the fact remains that the system is slow, and a lot of landlords are not getting the money they need to pay their mortgages on these properties. Long story short, more eviction cases are ending up in court, and that is where reps for the Oregon State Bar say a different problem has been brewing for a while.
Starting about a dozen years ago, we started to see a dramatic drop in people represented by legal counsel, especially in the areas of family law and landlord-tenant law. And it actually accelerated during the economic downturn in 2008. And since that time, we've seen a continual gradual decrease. And in fact, the state courts keep records of the number of people who show up without attorneys. And in the landlord-tenant arena, 83% of those who appear in court for a landlord-tenant matter.
That clip ended a little early. He went on to say they show up to court without attorneys. 83%. 83% of people in landlord-tenant court come without lawyers. And Senior Circuit Judge Dan Harris says most people showing up without lawyers are, in fact, the tenants themselves. And the same problem, he says, exists in family court. There are several reasons for this. The main one, money. Lawyers are expensive, and a lot of people can't afford their time, especially if they're facing eviction. It makes sense. Plus, Judge Harris says in some parts of the state, there are way more cases than lawyers anyway, especially in rural parts. This is a problem, he says, and it's a problem because it slows down the court system tremendously. And remember, there's already a backlog in the courts anyway, thanks to the pandemic. So what to do? Well, the Oregon State Bar has an idea.
Just recently, the Oregon State Bar, after we've been working on this for a few years, approved a proposed plan to license paralegals to handle limited services in the areas of landlord-tenant law and family law. A lot of the work that lawyers do is delegated to paralegals. Essentially, a paralegal is any person who is right now in a law office in the legal profession who is helping lawyers manage their affairs. And so paralegals prepare court documents, they prepare contracts, they do essentially everything lawyers do, but they have a lawyer supervising what they're doing.
On top of being supervised, Judge Harris says paralegals in this program, if it comes to fruition, would be covered by malpractice insurance, and they would be cheaper, maybe like $50 to $100 an hour, as opposed to $250, which is the average rate, he says, for a Portland attorney. So in the case of a landlord or a tenant whose case is going to court, they could schedule an hour or two with a paralegal, sit down, and just get guidance on like basic paperwork they have to fill out. Maybe get a roadmap of where the case is going to go, and so on, for much cheaper. Judge Harris notes other states have programs just like this, namely Washington and Utah. California, he says, is like Oregon, weighing launching it. So what do they want from you? Well, right now, they want feedback from the public desperately, especially if you've ever hired an attorney for a case or if you've chosen not to hire one and chosen instead to represent yourself. They want your experience. This is the webpage. It's osbar.org/LP. Again, osbar.org/LP. And please do it soon, they say. The Oregon State Bar is hoping to launch this program this summer. We'll be right back. That does it for the end of this show. Pick up your phone and follow us on Twitter at @TheStoryKGW or email thestory@kgw.com. Laurel Porter is standing by now for the news at 6:30.
This is KGW News at 6:30.
And we begin tonight with